Hey guys, Alex here from indieartistlounge.com. Today I want to show you a simple way to tighten up your drum recordings using some editing. I'm going to be showing this in Logic using built-in tools, but if you don't use Logic, don't worry. Other DAWs have similar tools. This video can still be helpful for you. The concepts I'm going to show you are transferable between DAWs. So let's dive in. The first step is we need to put our tracks in a group. So if I switch over to my mixer window here, you can see all of my drum tracks, kick, snare, overheads, rooms, and I've put them in a group called drums. Now, just note here that adding them to a group isn't the same as sending them to a bus, which you can see I've also done. What a group allows us to do is to actually synchronize some of our settings between these tracks. So for example, if I set up my drums group to synchronize the volume, then when I move the volume of one drum track, you can see that all of them move by the same amount, all right? But it's not volume that we're worried about right now. For editing, it's actually the phase of the audio. So you can see in Logic, it's a checkbox called editing, and underneath of it is phased locked audio. And what that means is when one drum track gets edited, all of them are going to get edited by that same amount. It's going to keep the audio in sync. All right, so once your tracks are in a group, then what you're going to want to do, what I like to do anyway, and what I would recommend, is go through and split up your tracks into pieces. So I like to do, like, say, the first verse, and then the interlude, second verse, chorus, and do each of those sections separately, because then you can sort of take a small chunk, you can get it done, and then move on to the next one. It just makes it a little bit less boring and keeps you focused. Now what we need to do is detect the transients in our key tracks, okay? Which actually means we're gonna have Logic go through and detect where the drums are actually being hit just from looking at the audio, all right? So in Logic, we're gonna be using what's called flex time. In other DAWs, it might be called something different, but it's basically a way for it to analyze the audio and move the waveforms around. And once it's done that detection, we're actually going to use quantization to automatically snap all of our drum hits to the grid. However, we're going to choose how tightly we want that quantization to be working, all right? Because if we snap everything right onto the grid, then it might not sound natural, whereas if we tell it just to bring all the audio, all the drum hits a little bit closer to the grid, then it can sound much tighter, but also still retain that sort of natural human feel to it. So we need to pick the tracks that we're going to use as our cue reference. And the cue reference is just the tracks that Logic is going to use for quantizing. And so in my case, I've picked the kick and snare. That's usually a good choice when you're doing drums. So it's going to analyze where the kick drum is hitting and where the snare drum is hitting, and it's going to use those two waveforms to quantize all the rest of your drums. And so to detect those transients, in Logic here, we double click on one of our tracks, and then it opens up this sample editor, and we can go in under audio file and click on detect transients. After we do that, you can see that it's drawn a bunch of little lines where each of the kick drum hits are. And it does this pretty good automatically, although it tends to pick up a lot more than you actually need. I've already gone through and edited this, but what you can do is you can use these buttons to increase or decrease the number of transients that it's detecting. So if your kick drum has like snare drum bleed in the recording, you can sort of keep hitting this minus until it gets rid of all those snare drum hits for you, okay? I've already done that. Listen through, make sure it's picking up kick drum hits and nothing else. You can also use your pencil and eraser tools to add them or remove them manually once you've got it pretty close. So you want to do that for both of your cue reference tracks, your kick and your snare, and then we're going to move on to setting up quantization parameters. So as I said, we're using Logic's flex time, and so we need to turn that on, and we need to select our flex time mode. In my case, I'm just using slicing because that works well for drums. Depending on what you're doing, you might want to play around with some of the other flex modes, but slicing tends to work well for editing a drum set. And then we're going to look at our quantization parameters over here. Now there are 3 parameters that you're going to want to play with. The first is obviously the quantize parameter, and this is the parameter that tells us what type of note Logic is going to quantize. So in my case, it's going to quantize 16th notes. So it's going to snap everything to the grid on the 16th note. And if I zoom in just a little bit, for the most part, it's actually quantizing by quarter note, as you can see, but there are a few places. Let me just find it, like in the snare drum where I do some double hits here that it quantizes to 16th notes. I often try to make this number kind of as low as I can get away with, typically, depending on how tightly you want things to be quantized. It just tends to be a little more natural if you pick a lower number here, but play around to see what works for you. The next parameter that you're going to want to play with is called the strength of the quantization, which tells us how closely Logic is going to snap these beats onto the grid. So if we picked a value of 100% here, it would take all of our drum hits that look like they're supposed to be on the 16th note, and it would snap it directly onto the grid so that it's perfectly in time. This might sound like a good idea, but actually it can tend to make your drums sound a little robotic, less natural, and less human. So I like to back off a little bit. I actually find that 85 is a pretty strong quantization strength. Often I'll go even lower, anywhere between 50 and 75%. And that way I can really tighten up the drums, make them sound a lot closer to in time and much tighter without removing sort of that human feel. And then finally, you want to pick the quantization range. And all that this means is just the distance that Logic will search around a 16th note on the grid to find a note that it wants to quantize. So in other words, it'll look at the grid, and if there's any note within, any drum hit rather, within 1/32nd note of the grid, it'll take that hit and move it closer to the grid. But if a hit is further away from the grid than that, it won't touch it, it'll leave it alone. So this allows you to kind of tell Logic not to quantize beats that you don't necessarily want it to because they're not supposed to be on that section of the grid. Often I set this value to half of whatever I'm quantizing by. So if I'm quantizing by 16th notes, I'll usually look within 1/32nd note in order to quantize here. And then finally, you just want to sort of listen and tweak. So if you have a listen to mine here, I'm going to play the drums with the click engaged, and you'll hear that it did a pretty good job. So those drums are sounding pretty good, and they still sound pretty natural because I haven't completely snapped them onto the grid. But you can see that I did have to go in here. There were some spots that didn't quite sound right, and I had to add some manual markers here and just tweak things around just a little bit just to make sure that everything sounded natural and good. So there you go. That's a nice way to sort of edit your drums, quantize them just a little bit, get a little bit tighter recording, but also still sound natural. Now, this only really works if you already have a drum recording that's pretty good. This is not going to take a drum recording that's way off the click and magically kind of bring it onto the click and make it sound good, but it can take a decent, good drum recording and tighten it up. So I hope you like this video. Again, I'm Alex from indieartistlounge.com. If you want more recording, mixing, production tips, check out the website, indieartistlounge.com. If you sign up to the newsletter, you'll get some regular free content, and I'll also give you some cool training products absolutely free. So don't miss that. Go check it out. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.